I've been studying economics for about probably 15 years now, right? And I'm not like a mainstream economist, any of this type of thing. But I most definitely want to be able to have a decent ideology or like understanding of how money works, right? And it's important as a whole to have an understanding of something that you use every day, right? You know, like my pops always said, you know, like you shouldn't be driving a vehicle if you don't know like exactly how the fuck it works, you know, because having a fundamental understanding of how something works makes you better at doing whatever it is that you're doing. You know, it's kind of one of those things, you know, you should care about the stuff that you do. And that's a, you know, I mean, good ideology to have. And in studying economics, what you're doing is you're studying like you're studying what people value in a certain area, right? And, you know, like economics is really just a study of like what people do every day, you know what I mean, and things of this nature, whatever it is, right, in order to earn goods, these type of things. Now, understanding macroeconomics is a different thing altogether, right? Because macroeconomics is like a big picture thing that not a lot of people can do, just because not everybody, number one, can be able to like picture things in their head, right? Because, you know, we're raising a lot of NPCs today. And in order to be able to have a firm grasp of macroeconomics, you have to have a firm grasp of the bigger picture of how everything works. So you kind of have to be able to like understand money isn't a currency, right, as a whole. Is think of it more as lubrication of a system rather than thinking of it as like shit that you buy things with, right? Think of it more as lubrication, because what money actually buys you is time in the end of the day, right? Because you trade your time for currency so that you're able to have more time in your home, right? Like that's ultimately what currency really actually buys is time in the end of the day. And so the currency is what allows like time to be able to be mitigated, right? So when you're buying like your fucking tomatoes at the store, you're actually what you're doing is you're saving time by not having to grow said tomatoes. If that makes any sense. And that's kind of where money works, right? And this shithead with this fucking thing, I don't even know who the fuck, 1D, one dime, I don't know. This moron, he doesn't really understand the macro picture of how everything operates, right? And he's not fundamentally wrong, but he is fundamentally wrong, right? Like, yes, deficits actually don't matter, right? But like on the same point, when you put too much currency into anything, it causes massive distortions, right? And it causes all types of problems because what you're doing is you're mitigating time, right? So like, and one of the reasons why you have places in Appalachia that are as messed up as what they are and continue to be so, regardless of how much money you pour into them, is because the answer isn't money. Right? Like, you know, they don't need more time. They have too much time to begin with, right? The problem is that their time isn't being used productively, right? And this is kind of the thing. And this is the important thing is that, like, yo, what you want them to do is, like, utilize their time together as a community to pull themselves out of what they're doing. Like, you want them to farm together, right? You want them to grow food together. You want them to become a stronger community together. You want them to actually, like, you know, become cohesive. And then what you want them to do is to build businesses, which they will have trust in. And then there's basically you're reintroducing them into society as a whole after society destroyed them, right? But giving them money is not the fucking answer, right? Like, you know, this is the problem, right? So like when you continue to have like federal spending bringing currency into an area, all you're going to do is have a whole bunch of Dollar Generals pop up to put a currency back out. This is what MMT is really about in the end of the day. So look, let's listen to a little bit of this, and we're gonna, you know what I mean, laugh at this asshole.
We believe in various myths to make sense of reality and rationalize the systems we live in. For thousands of years, we believed in the divine right of kings. Often you will find that the dominant ideologies of society conveniently fit the economic interests of those who are at the top of that society's hierarchy. People's own egos often play a strong role in maintaining these myths. It's not exactly comforting to realize that so much of what you are taught is nothing but a lie. It is often easier to get people to believe myths than it is to convince them that their way of thinking is already based on myths. One of the most common myths in today's political discourse that for some reason still hasn't died out is the notion of the deficit. The narrative that governments need to balance the budget, and that the so-called national debt is an impending catastrophe. There is a lot of unfounded hysteria surrounding the national debt, especially in countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, and the UK. Many people in countries like these still believe that their governments are flat broke and that their budget is unable to tackle some of the most important issues of our time.
Okay, so there's a part of my audience, right, who, are kind of like those alt-right guys who are anti-Jews, right? And they have an instinctual understanding that debt is dangerous, right? Because debt can always be used as a weapon. Debt is leverage in the end of the day, right? And so when you're taking out debt from other countries to create currency, right, in order to do spending, whatever it is, somebody else has the other side of that debt, right? And if your debt, if you stand here and you have, say like, $32 trillion in debt, and it's being held by large institutions, those large institutions have a lot of leverage over you, because what can end up happening is, and this is because of globalism, international trade. If they dump that debt, right, and just all at once, and they just throw it all onto the market, and there's no market for it, like nobody wants to buy it, right? The Fed will try to buy it, but ultimately, it ends up becoming a degraded asset. And then everybody else starts dumping their debt, and then everybody else starts dumping their debt, right? And as that debt continues to get dumped, and it starts dropping down internationally, being able to buy goods is a problem, right? Because when your workers who are expecting a certain standard of living, and they want to be able to go and have giant retailers buy massive amounts of quantities of goods, those goods now cost 10 times as much in the currency. Not in, the sense of that they're costing 10 times as much value-wise, but in the currency, in that, that unit of measurement, that ends up becoming a massive problem, right? And this is why debt is dangerous, just as an in general thing, right? So you have to understand that, the deficit, does it matter? Does it not? Controlling one side controls the other. Right, and this is important to understand, because when you dump currency into a place, this is what MMT is really about. And this is why this guy's an asshole, because he doesn't understand the basics of what he's actually talking about. Right, MMT is not the study of we can spend and do whatever we want. It's not even a continuation of Keynesianism. In the end of the day, right, like he states later in this fucking video. Right, what this is it's the study of how money moves around the system in the same way that oil moves around and lubricates a motor, right? And if you look at the United States economy as a motor, right, what you're doing is you're looking at how the government interacts with said motor and how the currency moving around affects different parts of the economy at different times, right? Because sorry, man, I'm dealing with my fucking cat trying to get on my table. It's just bouncing off the walls right now. So what you're doing is you're looking at this debt as a system, or you're looking at this currency as a system, as when I put this in here, it comes out over here, and when I put this in here, it comes out over here, right? And I have inflation here, because that's what happens when you pump massive amounts of currency into anything. You end up with inflation, whether it be inflation in that, when we handed out all these stimmy checks for a while, and we're giving out all this unemployment during COVID, whatever the case was, you ended up having inflation in, the cost of labor, right? Why is that? Because all of a sudden, everybody had more time. That's where the time thing comes in, right? So therefore, they didn't have to work. So therefore, you had to stand here and offer more people, right? Or they had to offer more currency to people in order for them to come do these fucking jobs. Right, all of a sudden you had a whole bunch of people dumping money into crypto. Right, you have it caused problems on the other side, right? Which we're now dealing with the 4 million people who have come in the past 2 years on the southern border, which is also driving up fucking housing prices. These are the type of things that you have when you have 0% interest rates and you're spending massive amounts of capital for, like, you know, fucking Social Security and whatever the case is, and Medicare, all this type of stuff. What you're doing is, right, is you're standing here having a distortion in the market where you're going to end up having boomers be able to have tons and tons and tons of, like, fucking retirement accounts to go buy houses. But as they pull that money out, the currency base becomes smaller, and therefore the whole thing turns into a fucking Ponzi scheme. These are distortions that are caused by spending money on social shit, right? And we can say the same thing about, like, fucking military spending, and I'm with you. I fucking hate military spending. I think it's dog shit. We should be spending like a quarter of what we're spending and not enforcing the entire fucking global goddamn trade network. But, you know, liberalism and globalism, you know what I mean, is what it is. Everybody likes cheap stuff. You like cheap stuff, we have to have global trade. It is what it is. Let's keep rocking though.
Whether the policy debate is about healthcare, infrastructure, high-speed rail, education, housing, or a Green New Deal to combat the impending climate catastrophe, the same question inevitably arises. How are you going to pay for it? Where will you get the money? You want people to have homes? How can we afford that? You want to invest trillions of dollars into climate change program to transition to a sustainable economy to mitigate the impending climate crisis? But what about the deficit? How are we going to find the monies? It's not like money grows in the Federal Reserve. I mean, trees. Isn't the U.S. national debt like 12 trillion?
Now, we talked about this in my last video a little bit, right? When I was talking about housing, right? Okay. So what you have is, we have a system in banking that's based on debt, right? And the debt, or leverage, as it were, with the banks, right? They all have assets. Their assets are your debt. So in order to have large amounts of debt that's going to pay long term for, like, interest rates for their loans, right? Because this is how banks make money. They have to continue to have housing prices be stable and go up, right? Because if people end up underwater in their housing, they're not able to borrow, and therefore, like, the whole, you know what I mean, like, fucking banking system collapses, which is what happened in 2008. Same thing will happen now. That's why we don't build new housing. This not, like, again, like, this is the fucking problem, right? Is, again, when you fucking stand here and you do something, it affects other things. This is what we don't have conversations about. And this is these nuanced conversations need to fucking happen before we just go, we gonna get the money, you fucking asshole. God, these fucking people, these fucking college educated fucks think they're so fucking smart. They don't understand. It's not about... Even if they're arguing in bad faith, or even if their argument comes from that, it doesn't fucking matter, because they're fucking remotely right. This is the problem, right? This is the thing. And if, like, I am 100% with, right? Because, like, I'm a millennial, right? I'm not a fucking boomer. And I don't care about the goddamn boomers. I say yes, give out free fucking houses. 100%. Yes. Not just cheap and affordable housing. We should be giving out free fucking housing to people. 100%. That should be a fucking thing. But we're not doing that, right? Like, you should just be giving houses to, like, fucking homeless people and underprivileged motherfuckers and families. Like, yo, for fuck's sake, we're running out of people. And what do? Like, we stand here and we go, man, listen, we should stand here and, you know, I don't know, punish people for, you know what I mean, having children, right? It's the dumbest thing ever, right? Legitimately, like, dudes have kids, and then, like, once the fucking female and the dude ain't together no more, you charge the dude for fucking child support. Like, why are you punishing people for making babies when we need babies? Like, this is the dumbest thing ever, right? Legitimately, it's so fucking stupid. Like, but we continue to do all this type of shit because, like, morality. And there's so many fucking things that we could fucking do. Like, if we stood here and just supported fucking households, it would make 100% more sense and make our country way more stable and make everything 100% better as fucking, like, human beings and citizens of this country. But we don't fucking do it, right? And it's not about the fact, where are we going to find the spending? It's because of the fact that, like, they want to continue the neoliberal system, right? And so, like, in order to have everybody be as productive as fucking possible, you have to make sure you're putting enough pressure on them to keep them productive, right? Because, again, money is fucking time. And if you give them more time, they're going to end up fucking spending it with their fucking family, and they don't want that. They want you to spend your fucking time in an economic system that makes you continue to fucking be productive, because that's all you're seen as in the fucking government's eyes, is a productive fucking unit. That's what all this shit is about in the end of the day, right? And that's the fucking real problem, right? It's not the fucking problem of, why isn't the government taking care of me? They shouldn't be taking care of you. Like, legitimately, you should be able to take care of yourself. This is the fucking problem, right? Like, 60 years ago, your parents didn't ask nobody to take care of them. You know why? Or your grandparents didn't ask nobody to take care of them. Because they didn't need anybody to take care of them. Because they could provide for them fucking selves. They bought houses for a fucking, a Monopoly get out of jail free card and a blue number 2 for fucking Uno and shit, right? And they had fucking car, like, literally, even when I was coming up in the early 2000s, when I was, like fucking early fucking 20s and shit, right? Literally, like, you could go buy a car for $400 fucking dollars. The average fucking used car price, $37,000 now. These are the fucking problems. Why did this happen? Because the government spent money in the fucking car market and bought up all the old cars. Reality. You cause disturbances and problems in the market when you spend fucking money. And whether or not it was deficit, and it was all deficit spending, right? And if somebody said, well, we can't handle this with a deficit. Great. Yeah. You know what I mean? Hell yes. You couldn't just go, we're going to ban Japanese automakers so you can only buy American, right? Which will keep our fucking union employees fucking working and keep our factories going, keep our fucking mill towns going, and keep everybody fucking rolling. No. You had to go, well, we're just going to crush everybody's fucking old car that they were driving that they fucking needed. Why were they driving that car? Because that's what they can afford. Now you push them up the value-added ladder, and you have fucking, $900 billion in fucking used auto loans that went belly up. The fuck? Let's keep going now.
Billion or 28 trillion or something? Won't future generations have to pay back the debt that the government created in its own currency? A lot of people unironically think this way. Even a lot of politicians believe this myth, and the ones who secretly do know that the deficit is just a mythical boogeyman have to keep pretending that it's real. Either because they don't want you to know that you are indeed capable of demanding nice things from the government, or because the deficit myth is already so deeply ingrained into the political unconscious that politicians are scared to challenge it. Sometimes politicians lie about the deficit as a talking point to perpetuate the myth of fiscal responsibility and use it as an excuse to push for austerity or shut down progressive policies that their corporate donors won't like. And often the politicians themselves are ignorant enough to actually believe the myth. The deficit hysteria is not just unfounded baloney. It is a highly dangerous myth that holds back human progress. The way that many people talk about the deficit today is comparable to how flat earthers talked about, and still talk about, the sun and the earth before Copernicus. But I feel like many of us intuitively know that there is something wrong with the deficit narrative and the way people think about it, as many of the holes in the narrative are quite easy to spot. Why is a deficit only brought up when it comes to spending on social programs? How come politicians don't ask, how can we pay for it, when they push for multi-trillion-dollar wars, bailing out the banking sector, or giving billion-dollar tax cuts to the wealthy, which all...
I can actually explain this right. This is really easy. Okay, so really simply put, when you put money into the military and it goes overseas or goes to like weapons manufacturers, whatever the case is, right, or goes to like military members, right now, active duty, I want to say there's only like a million active duty service members, maybe 900,000, something like that, right? It's not a lot. And then with the weapons manufacturers, they're like pretty like goddamn efficient. So when you're pumping money into this type of stuff, and then you're pumping money into the Pentagon, and then you're pumping money into like, Afghanistan, the money doesn't go and chase like milk and egg and bread in your local area. It doesn't go and break. And then the amount of currency that you're spending on soldiers, right, for like pay, where they're going to stand here and like, be able to create demand is very, very, very small, right? And when you have like real inflation in the economy, when you're going to actually notice it is when people have money put into their fucking hands. So when you do social spending, it automatically immediately hits people, right? Like people immediately fucking stand here and have, you know what I mean? Like they actually stand here and demand, or they have demands on the market, which ends up driving up the price of goods. Problem. Right, as a whole. When you spend on housing, it drives us, like we had this happen, and I've seen this happen in neighborhoods throughout, you know what I mean, like areas where I used to live. When you bring in Section 8, what it does is it stands here and actually pushes up rent. Right? Because like, yo, why is it that you would end up, you know what I mean, like having a working class family in the place that, you know what I mean, is going to try to pay the rent, but they're not going to be able to afford $1,500 a month religiously. You would stand like, because $1,000, $1,100 a month was normal 10 years ago for most Section 8 housing in a lot of neighborhoods, right? But and people would stand here and say, well, like, all right, you know, I really don't want that riffraff in the area. But in the same point, it's religious money from the government that's going to keep coming. It's why it is that like you have like households that end up getting destroyed when you bring in welfare, because women go, oh, I don't have to be relying upon a man who, you know what I mean, might end up getting hurt, or, you know what I mean, like having an accident, or, you know what I mean, like fucking getting sick. He won't be able to afford my fucking bills. I'll just rely on the government. He's way more reliable. Same type of thing. This is the fucking problem, is you have these massive distortions in the fucking market. And same social spending goes for like, for instance, the reason why like food stamps is under the Department of Agriculture is because it's a subsidy for fucking agriculture in America. People don't understand all this shit. Again, it drives up the price of agricultural goods. Simple, right? These are things that like people really don't understand, you know what I mean, that cause distortions in the market, but we're just so used to them, we don't talk about them. Now, when you're talking about like deficit spending, anything. So this is part of MMT. Like, why do you need taxes? You need taxes to eliminate inflation in the market, right? Because what you're doing is you're eliminating that currency, that lubrication, that time, right, that people have. And when you create too much of it, you end up having distortion. So you try to take that money back out, right? And you do so through taxes. And this is actually like how the system really works. And when you deficit spend, you're going to end up with massive amounts of inflation. Like, it's just how it works, right? Because like it's a shitty way of saying it, but people understand it, right? They're not going to understand like this conversation that I'm having with y'all right now. They don't fucking get it, because people are dumb. Like, it just is what it is. People really are. They're fucking stupid. Go watch Justin Awad's videos, right? Awad, A-W-A-D, right? You can go watch him. And, like, he goes and interviews people on the street. And I swear to God, like, people tried to name countries in 3 different countries in North America, right? And these motherfuckers, like, said, like, Wyoming, right, was a country, right? They thought that, like, Brooklyn and the Bronx were states. Like, they thought the Queen of England was from Japan. They thought the Great Wall of China was in Tokyo. Like, people are fucking dumb. So, like, saying deficit spending is easy enough, right? They're not going to explain to you why it is that they think it's bad, but they know it's going to affect the market as a whole, right? And it's going to have massive amounts of distortion when we do these type of things. So it's like 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Let's keep rocking though.
Add massively to the deficit. Why do conservative politicians always fearmonger the most about the deficit, despite historically running the most deficits? Hell, even Washington insiders like Dick Cheney admitted that deficits don't matter. Unless you are drinking the Kool-Aid of ideology on the daily, you can easily spot the clear contradictions in all of this. But we are not given the means to articulate it. This video will provide you with the necessary means to absolutely destroy the deficit argument when you encounter it. While many of the deficit hawk talking points could easily be disproved just by old-school Keynesian economics, and many economists today who are not total conservative ideologues usually understand.
Okay, so Keynes' idea, right, and this was highly important, was that what you do is you have, big slumps and valleys in, like economics over time, right, with, the markets and things of this nature. And so what you do is, while you're, going through like a big hump, like a big, like a boom, right? Just take a little off the top, you know what I'm saying? Like for like a little while, right? And you just save up. And then what you do is as like the market starts to turn downward, you spend. You take that money you saved and you spend it, right? And then what you did is you're like basically you're evening it out, right? So that you don't have a big valley where it's not a depression. It's just how you have a small recession and you go back up again, right? Because like that's just a cycle of markets, and you're trying to make the markets easier for people to be able to endure, and therefore continuing to drive, investment. That was Keynes' whole ideology, right? And he didn't want you to do this through deficit spending. He literally wrote a letter, right? Which, everybody has been trying to find for years, right? We don't know where it is. But like he wrote a letter to somebody and said, oh, wait, that's not what I meant. You shouldn't do this. You shouldn't just print money into like the fucking market, because like that's going to be bad and it's going to cause like distortions. And then you're just going to do it all the time because you want GDP number to go up so that you can stay in power. This is also kind of the problem as well, right? So this is also really fucking important. When you give the government workers, right, like the officials who, stand here and are like politicians, when you give them this type of power, they'll turn into Marie Antoinette and go like, yo, let them eat cake. You know what I'm saying? Like, yo, they'll stand here and they'll just give you nonsense when everything is burning down around you, right? And this is a bit of a fucking problem in the end of the day. And most of our politicians aren't smart enough to handle this type of like fucking responsibility. They're not capable, or like fucking, they're not people who you would trust with this amount of power. You should not give them this type of power because they're fucking dumb. All right, legitimately, and the voters are dumb too, because they're only going to vote for people who get them free shit, right? And then you're just going to end up with a whole society full of people who just want free shit all the goddamn time, right? And that's bad as well, right? Like, yo, that's as bad as the slavery side, right? Because like eventually it's just going to be like, you cannot just have like free shit everywhere and everybody just has everything they want. Right, because like everybody will end up, hooked on heroin and looking like Wally. Right, that's highly important. All right, let's keep rocking.
That governments don't operate like households, the main economic school of thought, which has by far the most rigorous and encompassing analysis of the deficit myth and how the modern monetary system in general works, is what is now called modern monetary theory, also known as MMT for short. Contrary to the dogma spouted by conservative deficit duds and libertarian goldbug fanatics, MMT is not just printing money, and it is not even a prescriptive policy ideology. It's almost misleading to call modern monetary theory a theory, because it's really more just a description of how the modern monetary system actually works, based on facts that are very hard to disprove once you understand them. Those who critique it without first actually bothering to engage in the material itself usually do so because MMT invalidates some of their ideological assumptions. While many of the ideas in modern monetary theory are not particularly new and derived from Keynesianism, MMT provides a more well-articulated and updated lens for understanding the modern monetary system, and gets some key insights into the origin of money and taxes, from fields that are outside economics as well, such as history and anthropology. Now, I don't want to name drop too many unfamiliar names, but it is worth giving a shout out to the economists most known for popularizing MMT, such as Warren Mosler, Larry Randall Wray, Bill Mitchell, and most recently, Stephanie Kelton and her wonderful book, The Deficit Myth. Key works and lectures from all of these economists can be found in the description of this video for further learning if you are interested. But I will try to give you a concrete picture of the main ideas in this video, so it is accessible as possible. Once you understand the key realities of how the modern monetary system actually works, the mythology surrounding the deficit discourse will be demystified, and you will go absolutely mad trying to watch the backward discourse on the deficit that is so heavily polluted by this deficit mythology. But first, what even is the deficit and the national debt? The deficit is simply a subtraction of two numbers: how much money the government puts into the economy subtracted by how much is taken out of the economy. The national debt is simply the all-time record of how much money the Fed put into the economy, minus how much it subtracted out of it via taxation. That's it. The national debt may look scary, but in reality, no citizens are going to have to pay for it, and no one ever will. And that's okay. What matters is not how big the deficits are, but rather who the deficits are benefiting. Is the deficit being used for wars and corporate bailouts, or is it being used to fund things like affordable housing, good quality public transportation, universal healthcare, and tuition-free college? Future generations, if they are lucky enough to survive climate change, won't have to worry about paying off the national debt. But they will have to worry about paying off their private student debt and their private mortgage debt, as well as the impending climate crisis. Coincidentally, conservative deficit hawks don't seem to care very much about any of these things. While this may be obvious if you didn't drink the conservative Kool-Aid growing up, for most of us we have to unlearn first in order to see the truth. To deprogram the deficit ideology that is so deeply ingrained into the public psyche. So let's demystify it one step at a time. The first step to deconstructing the deficit myth is understanding that governments are not like households. Even though we hear this analogy all the time, we often hear politicians say that governments must get their fiscal house in order, that the government must tighten its belt, and that the government is living beyond its means. This is a completely backward way to think, even though it works as a personal narrative to simplify reality in people's heads. Many people have the tendency to apply their microeconomic thinking of private business and personal households to the macroeconomics of the government and the overall economy. After all, if households ran continuous deficits like virtually all governments do, then most people would be bankrupt. But in reality, governments do not function like households, which should be quite evident unless your brain is swimming in ideology. Contrary to popular belief, governments with currency sovereignty cannot run out of money. I repeat, governments with currency...
Okay. It's not that, like, everybody thinks that the government can run out of money, right? That's important to understand. Like, no one really actually thinks that the government's going to run out of fucking money, right? I mean, the government can default on its debts, number one. Number two, governments can print their way out of problems. But that's also not a good idea, right? Because, like, Turkey and Italy and, like, fucking, Syria, there's, Morocco recently? Tons of countries recently, right? Venezuela, another really good one, right? Have currency sovereignty. And they printed massive amounts of money. And when they did so, they have tons of fucking social problems because the amount of currency that, like, it costs to buy things that are imported, right? For instance, like food. Right? Cars, parts for vehicles to keep things running, right? The cost of those things goes through the fucking roof, right? Because of the fact that your pay is not going to keep up with the cost of goods, right? Or basic inflation, right? In the end of the day, right? Because your currency is devalued. I understand that you can't just run out of money. And what you will do is you can print to the point where your money is fucking worthless. That's highly important to understand. And I think that's an idea that, like, you should probably, have a conversation about. I mean, at the end of the day, it's not about them running out of fucking money. It's about inflation on the back end, right? And this is what MMT has discovered, is when you put money in the hands of the people, it causes fucking inflation.
Currency sovereignty cannot run out of money. Even though you probably never thought much about this before, something deep down inside of you intuitively already knows this basic truth. Governments with currency sovereignty are the monopoly issuer of their currency. But just remember that this fiscal freedom only applies to governments that have their own currency and have most of their debt in that currency. Governments with currency sovereignty include the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia, China, Japan, and a few others. Keep these countries in mind, because all of what is being said in this video is applicable to countries with currency sovereignty, even though I will be mostly referring to the United States as a primary example, for simplicity's sake, because most people are familiar with US politics. The arguments of modern monetary theory apply to countries like this where the government is the monopoly issuer of a fiat currency, and is not on a gold standard. So this does not apply as much to countries in the European Union who have to use the euro and rely on the European Central Bank, or to countries which do have their own currency but hold much of their debt in a foreign currency, such as Venezuela, Argentina, and Lebanon. These countries do not have currency sovereignty. The notion that governments with currency sovereignty cannot run out of money has become an irrefutable fact ever since most of the world abandoned the gold standard, which was formally abandoned on an international level under Richard Nixon in 1971. But the USA abandoned the gold standard multiple times, most notably in 1933 under FDR. For those who don't know, the gold standard constrained the ability of governments to create currency, as an equivalent amount of gold reserves had to be held in proportion to the amount of money stored. Gold is a finite resource, and the gold standard system proved to not make very much sense as governments had to spend more and more to maintain the capitalist system. So the United States finally abandoned the gold standard officially under Richard Nixon, and most other countries did the same afterwards. Ever since then, governments who issue their own fiat currency and impose taxes in that currency, spend in that currency, and issue debt in that currency can never run out of money. The government will always be able to make all payments as they come due, so any payment that it has promised to make, whether it's your Social Security retirement pay, wars, military spending, government programs, or interest payments to government bonds denominated in its own currency, then the government can always make those payments. The way it used to work is that governments would actually print up that currency or stamp the coins to make the payments. But today it's mostly handled electronically, so it's a bit misleading to say that governments print money. Governments create most of their money virtually, via their central bank, by typing numbers onto a screen. Without boring you with the nitty-gritty details, the way it basically works now in the USA, for example, is that the US Treasury spends by having the Federal Reserve, the central bank, credit the reserves of a commercial bank, and that bank credits the accounts of the appropriate recipients of the government spending, the various actors that the government needs to carry out a certain policy. Voila! Money created on a computer with nothing but a keystroke. While many politicians probably won't admit this, all of the chairmen of the Federal Reserve, the people supervising the money creation, will.
The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money.
There is an infinite amount of cash at the Federal Reserve.
We print it digitally, so we as a central bank, we have the ability to create money.
The banks have accounts with the Fed, much the same way that you have an account in a commercial bank. So to lend to a bank, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account that they have with the Fed.
Technically, the central bank is formally considered independent in most countries, but in reality it essentially functions as the government's bank. The government effectively decides what the central bank's objectives are, and of course it finances much of the federal government's policies by crediting commercial banks and the appropriate accounts to those who need to carry out the policy. This common method of Fed money creation is not to be confused with quantitative easing, also known as QE, which is a less common policy that a lot of people falsely equate with money printing. QE is when the central bank purchases longer-term securities from the market in order to increase the money supply and encourage lending and investments. Now, we don't have time to get into the technicals of QE, but if you want to understand the difference between money printing and quantitative easing, the channel Money in Macro has a really good video about it that I highly recommend. Now, back to Fed money creation. Let's use one more example to illustrate how federal governments with currency sovereignty finance most of their policies. While this essentially works in a very similar way for every country with currency sovereignty, let's take the UK as another example to visualize, just in case you still don't get it. When Parliament approves the budget, Parliament gets the central bank, the Bank of England in this case, to credit the bank accounts of the institutions and the individuals necessary to make that policy happen. And there you have it. Now that the budget has been approved, new money has just been created and entered the private sector. If you still aren't convinced and think that it just can't be so simple, then I would highly recommend checking out the statements from.
All right, so let's adjust this, right? I'm sorry, I let this run a little bit, man. Listen, I was eating. Here's what the deal is, right? So it's not quite that simple, right? What they do is they fucking sell treasuries in order to sit here and finance like all this fucking money printing and spending, right? And so as they sell treasuries, right, they have a debt created on one side and then like an asset, which would be like the currency on the other side, right? Now, sometimes the banks just stand here and give out, like the treasuries to the banks, or the Fed gives out currencies to the banks, or the treasuries to the banks, and that ends up creating an asset for them which they can loan out against, right? Which is another way of doing things. But the problem is that when you have these treasuries created, right? What ends up happening is as you end up having so much fucking debt load, you end up having your debt get downgraded. So the cost to borrow for your government from, like whoever it might be, whether it's the citizens, whether it's another country, whatever the case is, you end up having your payments grow and grow and grow, right? And the interest on that fucking debt ends up causing inflation and problems in the market as well. Right, which is a whole nother problem, right, altogether, right? And the issue is eventually you end up getting to the point where people no longer even want your fucking debt because of the fact that, like, you're not going to be able to pay it off in a currency that has any value, right? That's kind of where everything gets down to, right? So if your currency doesn't have any value, like if it doesn't buy any fucking goods, why would anyone want it? Highly important to understand, right? So, but yo, look, man, listen, this is getting to be about like 41 minutes. I'm kind of done. I want to go get a fucking nap before I go to work. I'm gonna holler at y'all later. Y'all know the deal. Like, share, and subscribe. I'm up out of here.